Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, especially to Professor Kleinberg and Nama Cohen-Hanegbi, and to all of you for being here, although I hear that some of you have no choice. So it's very nice to see you. It's really a pleasure and an honor. So as a fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies this year, I have completed a draft of my second book project, which, as Professor Kleinberg said, is titled Conversion, Circumcision, and Ritual Murder in Medieval Europe, drawing on archival and published sources in Latin, Hebrew, and Romance vernaculars from Mediterranean and Northern Europe. This book project explores Christian conversion to Judaism as reality and as trope during the 13th and 14th centuries. In so doing, it exposes connections between Christian constructions of circumcision, the blood libel, and conversion to Judaism. The opportunity to participate in this workshop today has spurred me to explore some new approaches to my sources, so I'm especially eager to hear your thoughts on the material that I'm going to present. I'll be speaking about constructions of the religious identities of converts between Judaism and Christianity in both directions in medieval Europe. So I shall first present some general observations about Christian portrayals of the identities of Jewish converts to Christianity, and then I'll turn to examine the court records of a remarkable case from 13th century England, the case that inspired my current book project. And I'll be examining specifically how these records can deepen our understandings of constructions of converts' selves. In 12th, 13th, and 14th century Western Europe, including Christian Spain, so this is a context in which Christianity was dominant religiously, politically, culturally, and militarily, and Jews constituted an increasingly persecuted minority, popes, kings, bishops, and monastic writers frequently upheld an ideal of Jewish conversion to Christianity as an instantaneous and complete transformation from an old Jewish self into a new Christian one. Letters of introduction that Christian authorities issued for individual Jewish converts to Christianity, for example, described these particular converts, many of whom had in fact sought baptism on account of extreme poverty and other ills, as having converted upon receiving a divine vision or upon miraculously being delivered from harm. Such documents unfailingly proclaimed that through baptism, the converts in question had been washed, renewed, regenerated, or reborn in the Holy Mother Church, emerging as newborn infants. Further stressing that converts had been utterly stripped of the skin of their old existence and that their old selves had been discarded, Christian authorities declared that converts had abandoned the darkness of Jewish error and embraced the light of Catholic truth. Moreover, Christian authorities routinely confiscated the possessions that converts had owned as Jews, which were seen as vestiges of a sinful past, as well as welcome windfall, and they gave converts new names and new clothes. So on this slide, you see a letter of introduction for 4 Jewish converts to Christianity that I found in the Diocesan Archive of Girona in Catalonia. Composed by the local vicar, this document maintains that these 4 Jews suddenly received a vision of the Christ child and clamored for baptism. It also stresses the purity of these neophytes, these new converts. They were baptized naked, bringing nothing but their clean bodies. And to give you one more example, these illuminations from the 13th century, from a 13th century manuscript of the Castilian song cycle known as the Cantigas de Santa Maria depict another Jewish conversion to Christianity in similarly stark terms. In this case, a Jewish woman who is dressed in white in every panel except for the last one, converted to Christianity after the Virgin Mary saved her when Jews threw her off a cliff. So you see in the first panel on your left, the Jews are around her. Apparently she has committed some kind of crime or sin. They judge her, they throw her off a cliff in the middle left, and she is praying, standing on the ground, maybe thanking the Virgin Mary, who you see coming down from a cloud in the sky. who has saved her from harm. She fell as maybe she proclaims her new Christian faith in the bottom left, and you see her in the baptismal font with water being poured over her in the final panel. Through such rites, rhetoric, stories, and iconography, popes, kings, bishops, and poets and artists perpetuated a model of conversion that we associate with Saul of Tarsus, who became St. Paul in the New Testament. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read of Paul's conversion, that a great light shone down from heaven, blinding Saul until something like scales fell from his eyes and his sight was restored. So this Pauline model of religious conversion was characterized by a single clear moment of radical change. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a different type of source. Medieval first-person, so autobiographical narratives about conversion from Judaism to Christianity, as opposed to narratives that born Christians wrote about converts, admitted greater complexity. They tended to portray the transformation from old self into new self as arduous, more akin to a different model of conversion, one that is associated with the church father St. Augustine of Hippo, which is in present-day Algeria, who explained in his autobiographical work, The Confessions, that God turned him to God only after he endured great toil. So here we see Augustine presumably experiencing inner turmoil. In addition, medieval first-person narratives about conversion from Judaism to Christianity grappled with converts' unique identities. Some portrayed conversion as involving not so much a rejection of a Jewish past, as a superseding of that past and an incorporation of elements from that past into a permanently altered present and future. And in so doing, these texts portrayed individual conversions typologically on the model of Christian salvation history. Now, even though these first-person narratives about conversion from Judaism to Christianity presented accounts of the process of conversion and of converts' identities that were more richly textured than the flat caricatures of ecclesiastical rhetoric, their protagonists ultimately achieved the same result, namely selves that were stable, fixed, and unimpeachably Christian. This is not surprising. Reading these autobiographical accounts as literary constructs, Ryan Speech has argued that their authors were intent on establishing their own authenticity as Christian polemicists and apologists. Nothing short of a stable, fixed, unimpeachably Christian identity would have been useful for these convert authors to claim. In any event, it would have been ill-advised for a Jewish convert to Christianity to announce that the outcome of his conversion from Judaism to Christianity had been anything but a pure and unmitigated success. Especially by the 13th century, Christian authorities meted out harsh punishments to converts suspected of Judaizing or returning to Judaism like dogs to their vomit. In short, converts who wrote the stories of their own conversions retrospectively delineated their journeys and presented their present selves determined to satisfy and gratify their Christian audience. This Christian audience was thus, in fact, defining them. It is well known that the identities of medieval Jewish converts to Christianity, like the identities of all human beings, were in fact anything but unified, static, or homogeneous. Scholars of late medieval and early modern Iberia have mapped a spectrum of ways in which slightly later Jewish converts to Christianity religiously identified or were identified by others. They have developed theories of hybrid, multiple, and split identities. My own research on 13th and 14th century Spain and Northern Europe has contributed to showing, moreover, that long before the Pan-Iberian massacres and forced conversions of 1391, many Christians already questioned whether baptism could truly, totally transform an individual. Far from treating Jewish converts to Christianity like newborns, Christians often regarded them with suspicion, and they referred to them not simply as Christians, but as former Jews or baptized Jews. These realities, in fact, help to explain why popes, bishops, and kings insisted, against all appearances, that the individual converts for whom they wrote letters of introduction had indeed become brand new men and women. Royal, papal, and episcopal portrayals of converts, too, responded to urgent external demands. In the remainder of our time today, I'd like to explore with you a little-known document that sheds further light on medieval constructions of converts' religious identities. This document corresponds to source A on the handout. I hope some people have it, at least. Okay. I won't ask if you've read it. And this is my English translation of the extant legal proceedings that unfolded in Norwich, England during the 1230s. On the slide, you see the original Latin document from the plea rolls of King Henry III at the National Archives in London. Neither an idealized sketch of a particular convert, nor a painstakingly curated personal narrative, this document preserves a cacophony of Jewish, Christian, and convert voices, all of which weigh in on the alleged circumcision in the year 1230 of a 5-year-old boy. This dissonant chorus expresses with exceptional drama and poignancy the extent to which Jewish and Christian social and religious institutions imposed identities on converts, the extent to which these imposed identities could be in conflict with one another, and the extent to which converts could internalize these conflicting imposed identities. The Norwich circumcision case also reminds us that constructions of converts' identities could in turn be critical to constructions of communal and institutional identities, and it illustrates how, for the sake of preserving the integrity of particular constructions of communal and institutional identities, Christian authorities were willing to subvert culturally dominant constructions of bodily signs of religious identity. One last preliminary point. A great deal of terminological confusion surrounds conversion as an analytical category. The introduction to the wonderful new volume on conversion, edited by Yaniv Fox and Yossi Israeli, presents a great overview of this issue. For our purposes today, I'll be using the term conversion simply to denote an official change of religious affiliation recognized by the institutional authorities of the religious community being joined. So an official change of religious affiliation recognized by the institutional authorities of the community being joined. So let's dive into our text. As you might have read in source A, in Norwich, England, in the year 1234, this is a century after the notorious purported ritual murder of William of Norwich, which is much more famous, but at the time actually was less well known than this case would become.
Don't assume that they know.
Okay, so never mind. You won't be confused then. So just you've not heard of William, so don't confuse my guy with William. In Norwich, England, in 1234, a physician named Benedict came before the royal court in Norwich and indicted a Jew named Jacob. According to Benedict, 4 years earlier, in 1230, on the eve of the Feast of St. Giles, which happens to be August 31st, this Jew named Jacob had abducted, seized, Benedict's then 5-year-old son, Edward, who was playing on the street. Jacob allegedly carried Edward into his home, and he circumcised Edward because, quote, according to Benedict, Edward's father, Jacob wanted to make Edward a Jew. In the presence of the king's justices, the prior of Norwich, Dominicans, Franciscans, and others, Benedict also indicted 12 other Jews, including some of the city's leading moneylenders. And this sketch, which is famous in some corners of medieval history from atop an exchequer roll from 1233, actually includes a caricature of one of these 12 other Jews who was an important moneylender. You see him here on your left, Moshe ben Avraham, who ended up being hanged for his alleged participation in this circumcision. This is actually the earliest cartoon of an actual Jewish individual that is known to exist.
Point on his nose?
Yeah.
Yes, so Sarah Lipton who's a wonderful medieval art historian, has a whole new article which is cited at the bottom of the slide here, interpreting this image and giving you all the bibliography on the historiography of its interpretation. Yes. I should note at the outset that a fundamental ambiguity regarding 5-year-old Edward's religious status prior to his circumcision permeates the Norwich circumcision case. On the surface, our record presents Edward as the child of born Christians whom Jews indiscriminately snatched off the street and attempted to forcibly convert to Judaism. Christian accusations that Jews were actively proselytizing Christians in fact soared during the 13th century, and I believe that this case may be understood as, among other things, part of this trend. That is, as one more instance in an early instance in which 13th century Christians accused Jews of malevolently trying to seduce Christians into Judaism. Okay, so he's portrayed as a random Christian child, as the child of born Christians. There is a strong possibility, however, and herein lies the ambiguity that pervades this case, that Edward was not the son of born Christians. Several historians have argued, instead, that he was the son of 1 or 2 Jewish converts to Christianity. He could have been born after his parents' conversions, which would explain why he had not been circumcised. Now, according to canon law, to church law, a convert to Christianity was as Christian as an individual who was born to born Christians, because both were baptized. And this could explain why the Christian legal records didn't note that he was the child of converts, if in fact he was the child of converts to Christianity. To Jews, however, once a Jew, always a Jew, baptism or no baptism. If Edward's mother was halakhically Jewish, which would have been the case even if she had converted to Christianity, then Edward was halakhically Jewish also. And it would follow that if Jews did indeed seize and circumcise Edward in 1230, they did so not in order to convert him to Judaism, but to bring him back into the Jewish community. And it's interesting that Jews are known similarly to have sought to retrieve the children of Jewish converts to Christianity on several other occasions during the 13th and 14th centuries, and they were accused of doing so twice in England during this very same decade. In short, it is likely that Edward was a child whose religious identity Jews and Christians contested even prior to his alleged circumcision. In 1234, the records of the legal proceedings inform us, right after Edward's father, Benedict, came before the court, that Edward, who was now 9 years old, came to the stand as well. And here I'm going to discuss the second text on the slide. Upon being asked how the Jews had circumcised him, 9-year-old Edward recounted that in Jacob's home, one Jew held him and covered his eyes, while another Jew circumcised him with a small knife. Edward explained also that immediately after circumcising him, the Jews gave him a new name. To choose this name, they placed his foreskin in a bowl of sand and took turns searching for it with small straws. Edward was renamed Jernapin, which might have been a diminutive of Jernin or Jernet or Joseph, after the Jew who uncovered his foreskin in the bowl of sands. We do know that in medieval Ashkenaz, it was customary to let the foreskin drop into a bowl of sand. Okay, so that was 9-year-old Edward testifying in court in 1234 about what supposedly happened to him when he was 5 years old, 4 years earlier in 1230. Certainly, the testimony of a 9-year-old remembering his 5-year-old self is highly suspect. And I know this because I have both a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. Taking some methodological liberties here, however, I'd like to read source A not only cautiously as a record of some actual developments, including arrests, interrogations, and convictions, etc., but also as the joint creation of Christians who were influenced by a constellation of cultural assumptions. These Christian authors, in the plural, included the Christians who spoke at the trial, the Christians who subsequently presumably spoke about the trial amongst themselves, and finally the Christian clerk who put ink to parchment and recorded the Latin account of the proceedings that has come down to us. When we read 9-year-old Edward's account of his alleged circumcision in this way, it becomes, I submit, a graphic portrayal of religious identity, specifically Jewish identity, as something imposed on a subject. The young age of this particular subject renders explicit the convert's utter incapacity for consent. medieval Christians and Jews viewed children this age as incapable of making rational decisions or undertaking lasting obligations. It's noteworthy also that Edward is entirely passive in this vignette, and the Jews render him utterly helpless. They constrain him, holding him down and covering his eyes. Incidentally, the allusion to Edward's eyes being covered intrigues me. On the one hand, I suppose it would have made sense for Jews to cover the eyes of the child who they were circumcising. On the other hand, being blindfolded was a stock anti-Jewish trope in medieval Europe. The Jews were said to be blind to Christian truth. Thus, the woman who represents synagogue, found in medieval Christian sculpture, painting, stained glass, was nearly always portrayed as blindfolded. So here I'm just thinking of what else blindfoldedness connotes. And I'll add that the date on which Jacob allegedly seized and circumcised Edward, the eve of the Feast of St. Giles, also connotes the wounding of an unsuspecting, innocent victim. According to legend, St. Giles, and the actual saint was said to have died in the early 8th century in Nîmes, was shot by an arrow that a huntsman intended for a deer. So you see here an arrow has gone into the saint's hand, and he was maybe cuddling with the deer or trying to protect the deer. In any case, he's an unsuspecting, innocent victim. And St. Giles, whose cult was important in medieval Norwich, was the patron of the physically disabled. Okay, now I'm going to show a very different kind of image. This illuminated initial from a Bible that was produced within a decade of the Norwich circumcision case, meaning within a decade of the legal proceedings whose record we've read, and only a few kilometers away, seems also to depict the wounding of defenseless victims. On one level, it depicts the biblical Joshua circumcising the Israelites who have been born in the wilderness after leaving Egypt. These younger Israelites gaze at the Jordan River in the upper left, while standing on dry ground at Gilgal. The polemical overtones of this image, however, are unmistakable. Indeed, we can also read it as depicting a hairy, beak-nosed, grimacing Jew who is about to circumcise at least one tall, fair, naked, and apprehensive Christian boy. With his left hand, this boy points to his impending circumcision. With his right hand, he gestures toward the glistening water. Could this be to draw the viewer's attention to the dichotomy between circumcision and baptism? Is the undulating reddish substance on the ground blood? To my knowledge, no previous scholarly work has been done on this image, and I would be grateful to hear your insights afterwards. For the present purposes, I have brought this to illustrate the sense in which our text portrays religious identity, and Jewish identity in particular, as externally inscribed on a passive subject. As a subject whose self others defined, Edward was not unlike the adult Jewish converts to Christianity whom we mentioned at the outset, whose religious identities Christian authorities aspirationally caricatured, or who carefully crafted autobiographies for Christian consumption. Of course, as adults who converted in the absence of violence, these Jewish converts to Christianity, unlike Edward, consented to their baptisms. Yet their conversions, too, ultimately involved surrender or at least subjection to new external definitions of themselves. 5-year-old Edward is quoted in the trial records in a testimony that recounts how Edward allegedly escaped from the Jews on the same day as his alleged circumcision. So I'm going to go back to the other image just so you don't have to look at this. So 5-year-old Edward. So we already mentioned how 9-year-old Edward spoke in court in 1234. Now I'm saying that in one of the testimonies from the trial records, Edward is quoted as having spoken when he was 5 years old, and they say what he said shortly after his circumcision. He is said to have escaped from the Jews and collapsed on a nearby riverbank, where a Christian woman named Matilda testified that she found him weeping and wailing and saying repeatedly that he was now a Jew. It's very difficult to know what to make of this tearful imputed statement of self-identity, which comes to us third-hand based on testimony that was given 4 years after the fact. If Jews did indeed circumcise Edward, however, and if Edward did escape and collapse by the river in tears, then perhaps in Edward's solitary crying, in this expression of emotion, we glimpse a spontaneous expression of Edward's true inner self. And allegedly repeating to himself that he was a Jew, Edward, if he actually did that, likely would have been echoing what he had heard Jews say about him, perhaps what they had said to him. And repeating to himself that he was now a Jew, Edward could have been internalizing this new, imposed religious identity, even as he may have resented or have had little understanding of it. The records of the legal proceedings in the Norwich circumcision case present a parade of Christians who swore that they saw with their own eyes in 1230 that Edward truly was circumcised. His cut member, several Christians recalled, had been very swollen and bloody. Medieval Christians and Jews typically regarded circumcision as a mark of Jewish affiliation. Indeed, as established by St. Paul, circumcision was the sign par excellence of Jewish-Christian difference. Jews took pride in circumcision as a symbol of their faith in the eternity of God's covenant with Abraham, and they disparagingly referred to Christians as the foreskin, Aviv. For their part, Christians disdainfully referred to Jews as the circumcised, and to the abrogated law of the Old Testament as the law of circumcision. Our text reminds us, however, that Christian constructions of circumcision as a sign of Jewishness were neither stable nor constant. In imputing and insisting that Jews circumcised Edward, Norwich Christians never implied that Edward was now a Jew. They sought only to establish Jewish malfeasance. Indeed, in keeping with the Christian tenet that baptism imprinted a permanent character on the soul, Christians asserted that in spite of his circumcision, the boy had never ceased to be a Christian. Jernapin was Edward all along. In this instance, demonstrating that one could never cease to be a Christian required draining circumcision of its meaning as a marker of religious identity. It was a victory of the spirit over the flesh. This disassociation of appearances from a deeper imputed truth is not unlike the disassociation of appearances from a deeper imputed truth at play in the letters of introduction that we mentioned at the outset. In those letters, if you recall, Christian authorities characterized Jewish converts to Christianity, who often clearly had converted to escape personal predicaments, instead as having converted under the most irreproachable of circumstances. In both instances, Christians disassociated appearances from a deeper imputed truth in order to construct or negate conversions in a way that showcased the superiority of Christianity to Judaism. Just going to take a break. The records of the legal proceedings in the Norwich circumcision case depict the conflict between Jewish and Christian constructions of Edward's religious identity, not only through the tension between Edward's alleged tearful declarations of Jewishness on the one hand, and Christians' denial that Edward's alleged circumcision made him any less Christian on the other, but also as erupting in a fierce, bare-fisted brawl. According to the testimonies that were given in court in 1234, Matilda, the Christian woman who found Edward by the river, took Edward into her home. And following Passover, I can't help but think here of Pharaoh's daughter. The next morning, Jews began to arrive. With Matilda, her daughter, and many other Christians present, these Jews declared that the boy was their Jew, and that his name was Jernapin, and they tried to take him back by force. Before long, we hear a great multitude of Jews had gathered in Matilda's home, and with great force they sought to wrest the boy from the Christians. Hearing the racket, the Christian neighbors came over, and they too heard and saw the Jews call the boy their Jew and their son, and insist that his name was Jernapin. In the meantime, additional Jews complained to the local Christian constable that Christians wanted to take away their Jew. The constable set out to investigate their claim, and upon entering Matilda's home, he discovered chaos. When eventually the Christians in Matilda's home physically overpowered the Jews, and the Jews began to depart, this is very interesting, the Jews forbade the Christians to feed the boy pork because they repeated, he was a Jew. So insofar as we are primarily familiar with instances in which medieval Christians attacked Jews, this episode of mutual Jewish-Christian violence is remarkable. This very violence, I should note, and the well-attested Jewish visit to the Christian constable, complaining that Christians were taking away their Jew, in fact strengthened the likelihood that Jews did circumcise Edward in 1230 in an effort to bring the son of a Jewish convert to Christianity back to the Jewish fold. Medieval Jews are described as having sought Christian legal recourse and as having come to blows with Christians on other occasions when the fates of children whom Jews considered Jewish hung in the balance. In addition to adding to the evidence that suggests that the Norwich circumcision case was sparked by a Jewish effort to retrieve a Jewish child, the fight in Matilda's home illustrates acute Jewish and Christian awareness that the identities that each group assigned to converts between the two faiths were at odds with one another. According to our text, Jews shouted at Christians that Edward was their Jew. This awareness, I contend, is critical to understanding part of what was at stake for medieval Christians and Jews when it came to constructing converts' identities as stable and permanent. Insofar as Christians and Jews were pitted against one another in bitter religious rivalry, every conversion into one's faith and community was a victory, and every instance of backsliding, every conversion out, was a defeat. Norwich Jews' alleged warning to Christians not to feed Edward pork may be read as the bitter expression of a futile hope that Christians would support Edward in performing Jewish identity by observing Jewish dietary restrictions. It may be read also as yet another illustration of the extent to which others were in charge of defining and maintaining converts' religious identities. The Jews, according to our text, did not tell Edward to avoid pork. They told his caretakers, Christian adults, not to feed it to him. In addition, Norwich Jews' warning to Christians not to feed Edward pork may be read as a Jewish refusal to admit defeat, to admit that Christians' construction of Edward's identity, and not Jews', was going to prevail. Edward's statements about his own identity offer a window onto the complexity of converts' constructions of self. The records of the legal proceedings in this case provide us with two such statements. We have already discussed the first tearful one by the river. The second one emerges in a testimony right after Edward's father, Benedict, is portrayed as bursting into Matilda's house, where Jews and Christians were fighting over Edward. Very strangely, at this point, father and son don't simply rush into each other's arms. Instead, according to our text, Benedict, the father, turns to his son and asks him what he is called. What is his name? It is as though 5-year-old Edward, who has had no say until this point, is suddenly the final arbiter of his own religious identity, an identity he is to proclaim by pronouncing his name. Curiously, in response to his father's query, Edward is not portrayed as expressing a fixed inner truth, as one might expect in a carefully curated Christian narrative. Instead of stating one name for himself, he gives two seemingly contradictory answers. First, on account of fear of the Jews, we read, Edward responds that his name is Jonathan. Then, looking at his father, Edward rejoices, our text tells us, and says that he is his father's son, Edward. This imputed statement of self-identity clearly is conditioned by external expectations. Edward has two audiences now, Jews and Christians, and he seeks to give each one the answer it wants to hear. Please ignore the text on this slide. I'm interested, I bring it only for the image. I love how the symmetry of the mysterious iconography on this folio from the 14th century Barcelona Haggadah helps us to visualize the position of converts to and from Judaism vis-a-vis their new and former communities. I like to imagine that the three-faced figure in the center is the convert, Edward in our case, and the club-wielding hybrids on either side are Jewish and Christian authorities, respectively. Like Edward's first imputed statement of self-identity, moreover, this second bipartite one may provide further insight into the process whereby Edward was internalizing the identities that others ascribed to him. At this point, it seems, having been fought over by Christians and Jews, Edward's sense of self was conditioned by competing definitions of him. He was Jewish and he was Christian. Insofar as Edward's emotions may be clues to his innermost self, it is possible that Edward's second response to his father's question, his statement that he was his father's son, Edward, which was accompanied not by fear, but by joy, may have been more authentic than the first. At least it is possible that this is how the authors of our text envisioned or encoded things. Toward their end, the records of the legal proceedings circle back to focus on Edward's circumcision. In 1235, so after about a year of hearings in royal courts, Norwich Jews paid King Henry III to have Edward's body re-examined. Presumably at this point, Edward was living with his father Benedict, but the text doesn't specify. Earlier, we noted that Edward's case highlights that Christian constructions of circumcision as a sign of Jewishness were neither stable nor constant. Further complicating understandings of circumcision in the context of medieval Jewish-Christian conversion, the 1235 re-examination of Edward suggests that circumcision itself, although commonly hailed as a clear and permanent mark, was not necessarily either. As Jews requested Edward's re-examination, it stands to reason that Jews believed that this exam would show that Edward had not been circumcised, and that it would thus serve to exonerate them. Indeed, this request seems strange in light of the likelihood that Jews actually did circumcise Edward in 1230 in the context of re-Judaizing him. Strikingly, however, the 1235 re-examination produced ambiguous results. Instead of declaring Edward circumcised or uncircumcised, the report stated, the boy was examined and his member was found to be covered with skin in front on the head. Over the centuries, scholars have offered all kinds of explanations for this intriguing pronouncement. Some have suggested that it showed that Edward was not circumcised and that the whole case was a travesty. Others have argued that it showed that Jews did circumcise Edward, but that his foreskin partially re-adhered, which can happen, or that Jews surgically uncircumcised Edward. I'd like to make three observations. First, it is clear that the ambiguous state of Edward's body at this point, his circumcised status, was open to interpretation. Like the results of a judicial ordeal, it awaited Christian adjudication. Christian authorities determined that Jews had indeed circumcised Edward, and they hastened to punish the Jews. They hanged 3 of the Jews, and 11 more managed to flee. Second, the bizarre 1235 re-examination report reminds us that medieval circumcision, especially the circumcision of individuals who were no longer infants, could in fact be a messy business. And there is ample documentation of this in later Sephardic contexts. Third, the 1235 re-examination report raises the possibility, and this is purely speculative, no evidence, that Norwich Jews intentionally circumcised Edward only partially. At least one rabbi from roughly the same period, Eliezer of Metz, condoned circumcising adult converts to Judaism differently from Jewish infants. He said you could omit periah. Moreover, 13th and 14th century inquisitorial manuals repeatedly claimed that Jews circumcised Christian children and adults differently from Jewish infants, and specifically in a semicircular fashion. We don't have illustrations, so we don't know exactly what that meant. A scholar Scholar, an Israeli scholar named Zafira Antin-Rokeach, has speculated that Jews could have performed Edward's circumcision in a manner that was halakhically invalid on purpose, in the hope of reducing the charges against their community from religious ones, which were within the purview of religious authorities, Christian authorities, to charges of bodily harm, maiming, which fell under more lenient royal jurisdiction. Again, this is pure speculation. I do want to say, though, that if some medieval Jews did circumcise some Christians with an eye toward Christian appraisal, we would have here a fascinating phenomenon indeed. Jews inscribing what they constructed as a mark of Jewishness in a way that deliberately deviated from rabbinic norms in an effort to influence Christian constructions of that. In conclusion, the records of the legal proceedings in the Norwich circumcision case illuminate 13th century Christian constructions of conversion to Judaism. To our Christian authors, Edward's imputed attempted conversion to Judaism attested to Jewish malevolence. But it did not, in fact, transform Edward in any meaningful way. Norwich Jews had marked Edward's body and they had assigned him a new name, but spiritually, Edward was unchanged. It may be possible to read this Christian insistence that Christians could not truly become Jews as a veiled articulation of Christian fears about the ineffectuality of Jewish conversion to Christianity. The church taught, of course, that baptism, unlike contemporaneous circumcision, was spiritually transformative. Most actual Jewish converts to Christianity, however, seemed no more like new Christian selves, however, than Edward struck our authors as a new Jewish self. In fact, to the great alarm of many churchmen, significant numbers of Jewish converts to Christianity during this period formally returned to Judaism. In an era when Christian authorities were promoting Jewish conversion to Christianity and expressing concern about Christian conversion to Judaism, there seems to have been an undercurrent of skepticism about the very possibility of changing religious identities. The stakes were too high, however, to voice such doubts. To Christians and to Jews, converts between the two faiths had the potential to represent victory or defeat. Thus, Christians and Jews came to blows over Edward, and to maintain their grip on victory, Christians stripped Edward's circumcision of its meaning as a marker of religious identity. In addition to illuminating 13th century Christian constructions of Christian conversion to Judaism, and hinting at doubts that may have undergirded Christian constructions of Jewish converts to Christianity, our text beckons us to peer beyond these constructions to try to glimpse the converts themselves. Edward, being a child, sensitizes us, I think, to the helplessness that many converts experienced, finding themselves dependent on and at the mercy of their new brethren. Edward's evolving statements of self-identity affirm that converts to and from Judaism had multiple and dynamic selves, and that these selves were conditioned by competing external expectations. Finally, Edward's tears, his fear, and his joy remind us that converts also had selves that defied external control. Thank you very much.
Conversion is the crossing of the very boundaries that define faith communities and differentiate them from each other. As a phenomenon that involves elements of individual experience blended with broader problems of historical change, it has attracted growing attention from scholars in the last few decades, and much of this scholarship is mentioned in Paola's article that we got as a suggested reading, and which was very illuminating for me. A close reading of the case studies that received attention recently makes possible the rethinking of presumptions that have long been dominant in the historiography of pre-modern Europe, and especially in that of European Jewry, as again we could read in Paola's article. Analyzing conversion narratives from late medieval and early modern Europe has revealed that although Christian authors tend to stress the transformative nature of baptism as an event that signaled a complete break from converts' past, conversions are better understood as a lengthy, gradual, and often incomplete process of multiple transformations. These included not only the convert's fundamental spiritual reorientation, but also the alteration of her or his social standing, the creation of a profound rupture within the neophyte's family, and the destructive effects that the convert's original community of faith continued to have on their efforts to assume a new religious identity. Indeed, as we just heard, the persistent references to converts as baptized Jews or former Jews many years after their baptismal ceremonies indicate that, on the popular level, the theological notion of conversio as a sudden turn of the soul was not commonly accepted, and that Jews and Christians alike found it difficult to believe that an individual could shed off her or his old self and evolve as a new self. This remained true during the next few centuries, and I will of course give examples from the period that I'm familiar with, as we tend to do. In 15th century Italy, the Marquis of Mantua justified his refusal to pardon a convicted Jewish criminal, notwithstanding the latter's secret baptism in jail after his condemnation for a series of crimes, by claiming that, having been a bad Jew, he would make an even worse Christian. So we can see in this case, and in other documented cases, and there are many such cases from Italy, cases of conversions on the scaffold, which is a recent a title of a study by Adriano Prosperi, who has studied the phenomenon of scaffold conversions. We see not only how theological ideals, judicial policies often diverge from theological ideals, but also how that theological notion of baptism really was often not compatible with common sense notions of what constituted individual identity. The commonsensical view that rejected the ideal of a radical transformation of a convert's self was often expressed in the cases of individuals of a questionable past. The general distrust of Jews who had forsaken the religion of their forefathers in dubious circumstances or for mundane incentives was shared by contemporary Jews, so not only Christians but also Jews, and I'm again familiar mostly with cases from Renaissance Italy, for instance, in cases of inquisitorial proceedings against Judaizers in Venice, we find Jews testifying that, of course, this person was very dubious Jew, and now it's not surprising that they're not very distinguished or very prestigious Christians. And of course, as we could see in Paola's article, when converts from Judaism attempted to return to their original community of faith, they remained tainted by their past crossing of the religious boundaries, and no ritual immersion could effectively cleanse the stigma of their former apostasy. It is instructive that in the early modern era, which is, of course, in many respects much better documented, even those Jews who were known to have merely toyed with the ideas of embracing Catholicism and were never really baptism and were never really baptized, so they did not eventually go over to Christianity, incurred contempt and suspicion after returning to the Jewish community. We know that individuals, especially girls and young women, who had spent time in houses of catechumens but ultimately refused baptism and returned to their Jewish families, had problems finding prospective spouses within the Jewish community, and which attests to this phenomenon of suspicion towards reverting converts or prospective converts. And this once again discloses the rigidity of the boundaries that separated the two communities and the unwillingness to tolerate those who considered crossing them. Paola's research reveals the common patterns of Jewish conversion to Christianity across Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, and from an early modernist perspective, I have to say that I was struck by the similarities between attitudes towards converts in this period and those that were prevalent in subsequent centuries, when we have mass conversions and many more documented forced conversions, and the missionary efforts to convert the Jews were much more systematic and institutionalized, but I guess a long direct examination of this phenomenon would be the focus of another study, because this current project seems very broad enough as it is, just examining the traits of Jewish conversion from a comparative perspective in Northern Europe and in Iberia. So that's pretty enormous feat. And so, as we just heard, although medieval Christians did not explicitly question the sacramental efficacy of baptism, which was supposed to ensure the spiritual rebirth of Jews, in practice they doubted its totalizing, transformative nature. And Paul has reminded us that doubts about Jews' ability to truly become Christians and fears that converts would revert to their original communities of faith were not the outcome of forced conversions alone. Rather, they were already expressed long before the violent and forcible conversions in Iberia in the late 14th century, and even in cases in which converts embraced Christianity of their own initiative. This was undoubtedly so in the cases of adult Jewish converts, whose kinship, friendship, and professional ties with their first-right co-religionists could not easily be cut off. Indeed, we know that Christian theologians often placed their hopes in neophytes' young children, whose greater impressionability could result in a more complete conversion to Christianity. In the 16th century, child converts would even be asked to deliver public conversionary orations. And the case I have in mind is of a 5-year-old boy who delivered a sermon. It was called a sermon. It was an oration in Rome that was directed at the Jewish community. And so I wonder if the age 5 had, for boys, had any kind of symbolic meaning. And in any case, it's clear that the symbolic meaning that was ascribed to childhood and the role reserved for young and more impressionable neophytes served as a justification for the efforts to exert coercion in converting their parents, and even for the forcible kidnappings of Jewish children for the purpose of baptizing them, even though they were legally considered minor, and so, as we heard from Paola, still subject to their parents' authority. In 1508, the humanist and jurist Ulrich Zastius argued in favor of children's abduction and forcible baptism for this very reason. We can't, their parents would never really fully become entirely Christian, but it's a good thing to convert the children, because they could really become, as baptized after baptism, could really become Christian. Child converts, then, exemplified the ideal of a more complete conversion to Christianity than that which was realistically expected of their adult counterparts, and embodied the promise to grow up to become exemplary Christians. Nonetheless, the physical marker of circumcision that had been etched into the bodies of male child converts still served as a reminder of their Jewish origins. And since the sources that Paul has analyzed do focus on the issue of circumcision, I will now turn to this crucial aspect of the problem of Jewish conversion. As Paul has noted, Christian polemists often equated Jewish circumcision with baptism, which they presented as a circumcision of the heart. Regarding circumcision as both the prefiguration and the functional equivalent of baptism, Christian thinkers assumed that its sacramental nature left an indelible mark, which turned male Jews into unmanly men, and there are many studies dealing with this. However, as Shayat Cohen shows in his 2005 monograph with the unforgettable title, Why Aren't Jewish Women Circumcised? Gender and Covenant in Judaism, the stereotypical weak and ugly Jewish man was traditionally paired within Christian culture with the figure of a young and beautiful Jewess. By virtue of their gender, baptized Jewish girls were seen as converts who could be fully assimilated into Christian society, in contrast with their male equivalents, whose circumcised flesh served as a constant reminder of their origins, and who could thus never fully shed off their Jewish past. According to Shaya Cohen, Christian preachers and polemicists specifically targeted Jewish women and tried to persuade them that they had the most to gain from converting to Christianity, because of their anomalous status within Judaism as Jews who were excluded from God's covenant with Abraham because they had not been circumcised. The preoccupation with male converts' circumcised flesh turned Jewish conversion to Christianity in pre-modern Europe into a profoundly gendered phenomenon. While Christian theologians regarded Judaism as a male-led rival religion, it was female converts from Judaism, and especially those who were young and presumably untainted by Jewish perfidy, who could become powerful manifestations of Christianity's triumph over Judaism, since the erasure of their Jewishness could be a more complete one than that which male converts, including those who converted in infancy, could ever aspire to achieve. So Paola, I wonder if you can tell us more in the discussion part about the correlation of gender and Jewish conversion to Christianity in the 13th and 14th centuries. Were conversion narratives dealing with female neophytes constructed in ways that differed significantly from narratives centering on the stories of male converts? Is the fact that female converts were not circumcised underscored in any way in sources pertaining to specific conversion episodes, or was this primarily a trope? I mean, I find Chayakonen's argument very compelling, but I'm not sure if it has any kind of concrete basis. Can we know anything about the ease with which female neophytes were assimilated into Christian society in comparison with their male counterparts in this period? And does the fresh comparative approach that you employ to the question of religious conversion in this period makes it possible to detect differences in the gender composition of converts from Judaism to Christianity or from Christianity to Judaism? So much about gender for the time being. As far as the symbolical meaning ascribed to circumcision is concerned, it would appear that whereas no born Jewish male could entirely undo his Jewishness, baby boys born to parents of Jewish origins after their conversion to Christianity, who were duly baptized, could actually represent the ultimate desired outcome of conversionary efforts directed against the Jews. Yet, as your analysis of the 1234 case of Edward makes clear, the identity of a boy whose parent or parents had converted from Judaism was also far from fixed, arousing profound anxiety among born Christians. At stake were the very markers of religious identity, those that distinguished members of these two communities of faith. And even if, according to canon law, there could be no doubt that a child's baptism turned him into a Christian, halakhically, such a child could be regarded as a Jew if born to a mother who was herself a born Jew. Now, it is certainly curious that Edward's mother is not mentioned at all in the sources, whereas his father is presented as a devout Christian who rescues his son from the cruel Jews and later indicts them for having circumcised his son. And it's not because there are no women in the narrative, because we do hear about this good Christian woman, Matilda, who has an active role as a devout Christian. The mother's invisibility in the Christian rendering of this episode, which centers on a contested child, suggests that she had converted only reluctantly, following her husband's baptism, or even that she actually resisted the pressure to convert while pregnant with Edward, in which case her husband would have gained custody of her baby upon his birth in order to raise him as a Christian. So these, of course, are mere speculations based on my familiarity with much later cases. But you've also mentioned documented cases of Jews' assistance to Jews who were either contemplating conversion or whose spouse converted in order to help, especially Jewish women, escape to other Jewish communities with their children, or just being pregnant to prevent a newborn baby's baptism. I mean, again, thinking of the early modern era, most of the cases that I'm aware of contested children who were claimed by both Jews and Christians as theirs resulted from the conversion of just one of the parents. And this was more often than not the father. So I wonder if this could have been the case in Edward's story, if it could have been implied in a fictitious story or as a trope, still attesting to some kind of profound anxiety. Although conversion narratives often privilege individual conversions, we should keep in mind that family conversions instigated by one family member, often the father, were a very common type of conversion from Judaism to Christianity throughout medieval and early modern Europe. Now, of course, family conversions are hard to reconcile with the ideal of conversio, because it is unlikely that all members of a family saw the light in the Pauline sense at roughly the same time. Nonetheless, historians often regard family conversions as a type of voluntary conversions if the family member who instigated the decision who instigated the family's conversion made the decision to embrace Christianity in circumstances that were not under direct threat of violence, so which was the case in mass forced conversions in Iberia. So in cases in which this was not the case, these are often considered as voluntary conversions. We do, however, know, as Ira Katzenelson and Miri Rubin have reminded us, that voluntary is a tricky concept when treating Jewish conversion to Christianity. In a society characterized by Christian dominance, some degree of pressure to convert was always present, even if it was merely hinted in Lent sermons or in Holy Week processions, and in the threat of violence, rooted in the majority's long-standing hostility towards the Jews that always lurked behind them. The numerous cases of Jews who became Christians primarily as a result of spousal conversion, or of the conversion of their parents, even if they were already adolescents, further problematizes the supposed distinction between forced and voluntary conversions. Yet, however we could classify their type, Jewish conversions to Christianity always had a far-ranging ramification, not only for the converted individuals, but also for their families and their communities. In the paper we just heard, Paola has argued that Edward's circumcision and the assignment of a new Jewish name were aimed at publicly reclaiming him as a member of the Jewish community, by physically imposing a Jewish identity that was supposed to supersede the Christian one. So the circumcision of an uncircumcised descendant of Jewish parents was an act of retrieving this child from the Christian community. The men who performed such circumcisions on adult or on children who were no longer babies were not merely fulfilling a mitzvah, they were inscribing a communal identity on the bodies of the born Christians they were circumcising. And again, I cannot help but speaking on the early modern era, when following waves of mass-forced conversions and exile, one Judaizer in Ferrara specialized in circumcising born Christians who arrived from Portugal, assigning them Jewish names and enabling them to start a new life as Jews in the Italian peninsula. Like the Jews found guilty of having attempted to impose a Jewish identity on Edward, who were sentenced to death, the ritual circumciser, who was active in Ferrara in the second half of the 16th century and who reportedly performed about 800 circumcisions of born Christians, was publicly executed in the end. That is my final point, because I know everyone is hungry. The last source in Paula's handout, which was sent in advance, so I'm hoping you read it, reminds us that as a trope, the practice of circumcision formed an important part of the myth of Jewish cruelty that was to play a prominent role in narratives of ritual murder in the late Middle Ages. In this period, the circumcision of baby Jesus gained prominence in artistic representations of the life of Christ and was presented as a prefiguration of his passion and crucifixion. Thus, the infliction of physical pain on the body of the innocent baby Jesus by the hands of the cruel Jews was conflated with the torments that he suffered as an adult as a result of Jewish cruelty. Artistic representations of child martyrs, and the one that I have in mind is the much publicized case of Simon of Trent from the late 15th century, also stressed the Jews' attempts to circumcise an innocent Christian boy as an epitome of their guilt, which harkened back to their role in facilitating Christ's death at the cross. Not only in the account of Matthew of Paris, which again was on Paula's handout, but also in the case of Edward that we heard about a few minutes ago, Jewish cruelty finds its utmost expression in the great pain that the Jews inflicted on an innocent Christian boy by way of circumcising him. The purported Jewish felons, however, are not sentenced to death because of the child's physical suffering, but rather because the deed that they reportedly performed signified a mockery of Christ's crucifixion and hence an offense to the Christian religion. Because of the association of Christ's passion with the circumcision that had prefigured it, every allegation pertaining to the circumcision of a baptized child provoked thoughts of the Jews' recklessness and perfidy, as manifested in the role that they were believed to have played in the crucifixion. And so, one may be left wondering whether questions of individual identity are really the issue here, or whether such narratives should really be read primarily as a particularly gruesome genre of anti-Jewish polemics. Thank you. Thank you.